In 1968, the Beatles founded Apple Corps, a company that would give up-and-coming creatives across music, fashion, electronics and more the opportunity to have their visions realised without having to beg major companies. Oh, and for tax reasons. Mostly for tax reasons. One subsidiary was Apple Films, a film production company that made a combination of documentaries, rock and roll musicals and more. Although they only made 9 of them, the films they decided to make and support give a fascinating insight into what interested the Beatles at the time, especially for those of them who continued producing films after it was dissolved. Today, I'm going to rank and review them all.
The world's first rock and roll Dracula movie.
The son of Dracula is Nielsen at his hottest, Ringo at his magical magnificence, horror at its funniest.
Harry Nilsson is Dracula's son, who is now old enough to ascend to the throne of the Netherworld. However, as he falls in love with a human woman, the powers that be try to maintain their control. Okay, I've already made 2 videos about this film, so I'll make it brief. I'll start off with the positives. Nilsson's music is great. This includes one original song. As someone who's never toured, it's significant that this film has scenes in which he performed live. I thought the supporting cast weren't bad actors. I like this one shot where Nilsson's character turns into a bat. As for the negatives, it is unrelentingly tedious, with a near total absence of conflict, despite there being plenty of potential in the basic setup. It just feels like a film that nobody put any care or thought into, and it's a painful experience. You're better off just listening to the soundtrack album. As awful as this film is, I would like to see an official release of it someday. Not only for the fans of the film, as pretty much every film does have its fans, but for the preservation of film in general. However, there is a fan restoration of the potato quality VHS rip, which I will link in the description.
I just can't see that it makes sense.
Let me start off by saying I am as surprised as you are that the film is this far down on my list. It's really hard to discuss Let It Be as the original product in a post-Get Back world, but I will try to start off with. Let It Be is basically a concert film. Obviously, only the rooftop concert at the end is actually a concert, but most of the film is just listening to the Beatles playing song after song after song. There's a bit of conversation here and there. We get to see the creative process of the Beatles a bit. We get to see them messing about. They snap each other a couple of times. But most of it is just the music. So if you just want to watch the Beatles play together, then I do recommend Let It Be. I think the thing that bothers me about this is that we don't get that much of a sense of who the Beatles are or the progression of events as they unfolded. We feel very much like outsiders looking in rather than a fly on the wall. Is director Michael Lindsay Hogg to blame? I'm hesitant to say yes. We do now know that his fly-on-the-wall filmmaking recorded some fantastic material, and I think some of it would not have been appropriate to release at that time. Get Back shows us the days as they unfolded, and occasionally fills us in with what's going on. It feels like we've spent 2 weeks hanging out with the Beatles rather than overhearing a band bicker between songs in a noisy pub. As for whether it misrepresents the Beatles by showing too much negativity, and whether this gave Paul and Ringo a Mandela effect that led them to thinking that this period was more miserable than it was, well, what would they have been more likely to remember after a long day of recording? All the good times they had mucking about, or that one time their best friend snapped at them? I think Michael Lindsay Hogg was aiming to use some of the most interesting material, so using those negative moments made sense. Then again, he did not use the material of the Beatles at their most vulnerable. To be fair, I don't know whether that was up to him or if there was any interference from Alan Klein and the like. I imagine it would have just been too raw to show these moments at the time. So, yes, Let It Be just wasn't that much fun for me. Again, if you mainly just want to see them play and the songs, I'm sure you'll like it, but there's really very little else. If you're going to watch one or the other, watch Get Back. Obviously it's considerably longer, but it's a genuinely intimate portrait of their time together. Give it a go. I think the fact that they never allowed this to get a home media release apart from VHS because they felt it was too negative, it was ridiculous. I always thought that, but now I've actually seen the film, I honestly can't see what all the fuss was about.
And he says, Dad, there is only one thing I want to tell you. I did not do this crime, and I want you, Mum, Richard, and Peter, and Michael, never let anybody say wrong against me. I want you to clear my name.
This documentary was produced by Lennon after he became involved in the movement to clear the name of James Hanratty, one of the last criminals to be executed in Britain. He was hung for the murder, attempted murder, and assault of a young couple, the verdict of which was highly controversial. Now, there have been more recent investigations, and I won't reveal their findings here in case, like I was, you are unaware of the verdict decided by more recent evidence. The documentary is made up of interviews with his parents, a film talk about the campaign to clear his name, and a few interviews with their supporters. That may not sound like enough to sustain a film, but thankfully it is only a short, at just over 35 minutes in length. Obviously, it is certainly a documentary that is trying to make you think a certain way, but regardless of whether or not Hanratty committed the crime, it certainly makes a good argument against capital punishment. As someone who had been unaware of the case, I found it fascinating and compelling, but I don't know if true crime enthusiasts, who already know more about the A6 murder, would be as interested. It's a fascinating artefact regardless. It was only ever publicly screened once, in the crypt of a church in London in 1970, and has never had any other kind of release. But thankfully, some good Samaritan has uploaded the whole thing to YouTube. And yes, I'm surprised I'm ranking it above Let It Be too. I don't think that it was a better made film, I just found it more interesting.
Mr. Harrison, with all of the enormous problems in the world, how did you happen to choose this one to do something about?
Because I was asked by a friend if I'd help, that's all.
In 1971, the situation in Bangladesh was desperate. Not only were 500,000 people killed by a cyclone, at least 250,000 were killed by the genocide carried out by West Pakistan, leading to the Liberation War, in which they fought to be the independent country they are today. This led to the starvation of both thousands of refugees and those who remained. Ravi Shankar, who himself was from the region and had family who were suffering themselves, begged his friend George Harrison to help him raise awareness of the tragedy that the international press were largely ignoring and raise money to help those in need. In a very short space of time, George Harrison invited some of his most famous musical friends to come together to perform in a once-in-a-lifetime concert to do just that. So, before you complain about it being so low on my list, I want it to be clear now that I think Concert for Bangladesh is a great concert film. It's a concert film that does exactly what it says on the tin. I enjoyed it throughout, I liked all of the music in it. I think I would have enjoyed it more if I was a bit more familiar with the songs and the artists, but I've only really scratched the surface of the Beatles' solo careers and the others who performed here. There is very little that could go wrong here, and nothing does. The films higher up on this just are of more interest to me personally. I highly recommend it if you're a fan of anyone who performed that night. I'm definitely going to check out some of the songs I discovered through this film. The middle of the concert is an absolute joy, starting off with high energy before the softer ballads of Bob Dylan later in the show. However, the concert is bookended by bringing attention to the suffering that the concert is in aid of. Firstly with Shankar's performance of a track from the region, and lastly with Harrison's track, Bangladesh. The film accompanies both of these tracks by intercutting footage of the starving people of Bangladesh. I read the comments under a video about the concert from grateful Bangladeshis talking about how important this was and how they found out about George Harrison from their history textbooks at school, and I honestly started tearing up. It's just so moving to see the impact this concert had. It's undoubtedly the most important film on this list because of this. If you want to find out more about the fascinating history of the concert and all of the context surrounding it, you have to see Lars Land's deep dive into it. If you're watching this video, you should definitely check out their channel because it is an absolute treasure for Beatles fans. I was even planning on recommending this video regardless of whether or not I saw it. Their videos are just that good. So yes, I love this film, I just personally prefer later films on this list.
Musicians good to fill the scene with strange dreams and rock and roll.
Some people like to rock. Some people like to roll.
But a moving and a grooving's going to satisfy my soul.
Born to Boogie was Ringo Starr's directorial debut, and it was a concert film of the band T-Rex at the height of their fame. You may not have heard of T-Rex or recognise them, but you will certainly recognise their songs, especially if you have seen the film Billy Elliot. Anyway, after the breakup of the Beatles, T-Rex Hysteria was briefly the replacement for Beatlemania in the UK. They did have success in the States and other places too, but not to the same extent. As well as the concert footage filmed at Wembley, it includes scenes of sporadic surreal poetry, a Mad Hatter's Tea Party, and a jam session with Elton John. In fact, the acoustic string melody of Mark's songs was a spontaneous decision made on the day of filming. They had to just ask the quartet to mime something, and then they worked it out in post, which does explain why the musicians looked so confused. However, I didn't notice the performance wasn't quite synced until after I found that out, and the end product sounds incredible. It's a shame that it isn't on Spotify or something. It's a lovely track. Some older viewers may recognise actor Geoffrey Belden from his roles as the title character in Cat Weasel and the Crowman in the original TV series of Wurzel Gummidge. He was cast because Starr and Bolan were both fans of the former. It will also be of interest to Beatles fans that this scene was filmed in the garden of John's home in the UK, where the promo video for Imagine was filmed. Combining stuff like this with the concert footage was a nice change of pace. There's also a bit where they couldn't get through a take without laughing, so they just put the blooper in the film instead, and it's just so joyful to watch.
Some people like to rock.
I personally wouldn't recommend it as an introduction to the music itself, as I think that the arrangement with strings, such as in Cosmic Dancer and Children of the Revolution, are a big part of what makes the band sound so iconic. However, that's not to say that I don't like the rawer sound of the live versions of these songs. It's great to hear them doing extended solos and stuff. Mark Bolan just steals the show. He has this electric energy live, and it wasn't an act. I remember hearing an interview with someone saying that Bolan put just as much energy into his studio recordings as he did when he was on stage. He was just really passionate about what he did, and you can see that in his performance. He really was born to boogie. I can really believe that he danced himself right out the womb. It's hard to believe that this was the second concert he did that day. You can watch the other one on YouTube. He's just as brilliant. For those of you who don't know, T-Rex was Mark Bolan's band, the same way that Motorhead was always Lemmy's band, no matter who else was in the band's lineup. I thought I'd just make that clear in case you're confused as to why the rest of the band aren't really featured as much. By the way, I got the special edition box set a few years ago when it first came out, and I highly recommend it, not only for the restoration and the full concert footage, but for more unused footage and behind-the-scenes interviews, including ones done by Mark's son Roland. For those of you who don't know, he was only 2 years old when his father died, so he basically does these interviews with those who knew his dad in order to get closer to him. It also includes CDs of both of the live performances. I first watched this when I was deep into my Mark Bolan phase, but even though I don't listen to T-Rex every day anymore, I still absolutely love this film. Its variety keeps it interesting, and at just under an hour in length, it doesn't overstay its welcome. This film is just so much fun. Honourable mention to The Magic Christian, a film starring Ringo with a soundtrack by an Apple band, which I believe I'm right in thinking the Beatles had a hand in producing, but under a different company name. If you're interested in that, you can watch my review of it up here.
I wonder what's going on down there. Chucking me out, the bastard. Culmination of 5 years arsing around. Surprised he let me go on so long. I'll make more trouble away from that place than I ever did inside it.
Little Malcolm in a Struggle Against the Enochs, sometimes just shortened to Little Malcolm, follows Malcolm Scrordyke, played by the late John Hurt, a young art student who has just been expelled from university for his disruptive behaviour. He decides to enlist his friends to start a neo-fascist political party and take over the country, starting by kidnapping the teacher who expelled him. This was based on a play, and you can tell. Whilst it looks like they probably added more scenes and locations, it's still pretty slow-paced, which I can see putting some people off. However, I certainly never found the film dull. I thought it was fascinating. The soundtrack is very minimal, only coming in during the most intense moments and helping the film feel grounded. Malcolm does soliloquize a bit when he's alone, which could pull people out of the film a bit, but I think it's a really important insight into how fickle and cowardly he is. John Hurt gives an electrifying performance as the loud yet pathetic Malcolm. It's a wonderful part, and Hurt captures the comic duology of the character. I thought the rest of the small cast were great too. David Warner, who I had only seen in The League of Gentlemen's Apocalypse and Inside Number 9, is wonderful in this as Dennis Nipple.
That's not my name.
What is your name?
Dennis Charles nipple.
He's very autism-coded and probably the most sympathetic out of the four revolutionaries. I love the fact that in the credits when they thank Huddersfield University, they have to clarify that their accommodation isn't as depicted. I can understand why. The setting of this film is wonderfully grotty, the perfect backdrop for these discontented young men. This was produced by George Harrison, who plays a nice little song over the end credits. This film's release was mangled in the dissolution of Apple and their fight with Alan Klein, so this wasn't seen by many when it first came out, but it has received appraisal since, getting a BFI home media release in recent years. This may sound odd, but this film felt like a cross between Citizen Smith and Lord of the Flies, presented as a post-war kitchen sink drama. That or a cross between Billy Liar and Brecht's Arturo Ui. The film comically highlights the ambition of these characters by portraying them as so childish and pathetic. I think that the commentary still has political relevance today, particularly regarding loyalty and misinformation. I recommend this film if you like kitchen sink dramas, if you like political satire, and if you're a fan of any of the actors involved. I imagine it would appeal to fans of the play. I am slightly foggy on who else would enjoy this film, but I for one really enjoyed it. It's not for everyone, but I really don't think I could fault it. Magical Mystery Tour is a Wonderland-esque psychedelic dream. Nothing more, nothing less. I can see why people love it, but I can see why people hate it too. It's the disjointed cinematic ramblings of the drug-addled minds of the Beatles. But if you just turn off your mind, relax and float downstream, it's a lovely little dreamlike experience. Don't go into it expecting a cultural milestone like their Richard Lester films. This is not a professional film, but a silly little home movie. And in a good way, not in a give my regards to Broad Street way. Therein lies the charm. It was just the Beatles messing around with making a variety special, and it's a fascinating insight into them. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on this film, I did make a video essay on why I consider Magical Mystery Tour to be a variety special rather than a movie, and why it did better than a lot of other variety specials attempting a plot, which you can watch up here.
To be received like this in a foreign land, my God, I have never felt so much warmth and openness. But I wonder how much they can understand.
I genuinely didn't know what to expect with Raga. I knew it was a documentary about Ravi Shankar, but I had no idea what kind of documentary it was. A concert film? A day in the life? As the film started, I could tell that the pace would be leisurely, so whilst I don't necessarily think of that as a bad thing, I wasn't expecting much. Oh, how wrong I was. Raga is an incredible experience. The film begins with Shankar in India. We see him revisit his old music teacher, we see him visit his spiritual guru, we see Indian life as they struggle between the preservation of tradition and the globalisation of modernity. We see him teach the rituals they do to bond teacher and student. Then we see Shankar in California, receiving an honorary doctorate, playing at the Monterey Pop Festival, playing with acclaimed classical violinist Yehudi Menuhin, and teaching American students Indian music. We hear Shankar reflect on his ambition to introduce the Western world to Indian music finally being realised, and his fears that it is being appropriated by those only scratching the surface as part of the hippie aesthetic, rather than taking in the all-encompassing religion that accompanies Hindustani classical music. It's also a fascinating insight if you're a fan of George Harrison. I'm sure if you're a Beatles fan, you're more than aware that, when he started becoming interested in Indian classical music, he eventually adopted Hinduism as his religion, and stayed one for the rest of his life. This is a film about the culture that entranced him and changed his life forever, as well as the man who became his lifelong friend. If we get another Beatles biopic, can we please just have one about George and Ravi Shankar's friendship? I know the world isn't crying out for yet another story of a white person going to India to find themselves, but I believe it could make a really fascinating movie. It had all of the intimacy I felt Let It Be lacked, and I would highly recommend it if you have any interest in Indian culture, the impact Indian culture had on the 60s, or Shankar in general, even if that interest is merely through his connection to George Harrison. This was very, very nearly my number one spot. But, for some reason, I just couldn't quite let it usurp the undeniable champion. You must have known as soon as you realised that this film was made by Apple that this would be at the top of my list, right? After Help, the Beatles no longer wanted to make feature films. However, they had a 3-picture deal with United Artists, so they had to appear in one more. However, there was a way in which they could star in the movie without actually having to be in it themselves. Produce an animated movie, get played by voice actors, as they had done in the cartoon series, and make a live-action cameo as themselves in the end to fulfil their contractual obligation. Said contractual obligation arguably had the greatest legacy out of any of their other films. Yellow Submarine follows John, Paul, George and Ringo as they are enlisted by Old Fred to save the home of Pepperland from the Blue Meanies, an army of creatures who delight in sapping colour, joy and music from its peaceful citizens. In their Yellow Submarine, they must travel through a series of strange seas and stranger musical numbers to bring peace to Pepperland. This film is everything the 1978 Sgt. Pepper movie wishes it could be. It's not the fact that it uses the original Beatles tracks, although it certainly does help. It's proof that you can do style over substance and make it work. It fully embraces the simple plot and leads into the visual style hard. The dialogue is a real treat. I've been watching this film for years and I literally only just got one of the puns whilst writing this video.
Frankenstein?
Oh yeah, I used to go out with his sister.
Whose sister?
Yeah, Phyllis.
It has a marvellously offbeat sense of humour, not dissimilar to that of the Beatles themselves. Like the cartoon series, these are caricatures of the Beatles, but based on their more recent public images and less insulting. Oh, Ringo, they really did you dirty.
Yeah.
Anyway, the voice actors do marvellous impressions of them. Many people don't know that the Beatles didn't voice themselves without being told. I also love the voice of the deliciously evil Chief Blue Meanie. It's simply iconic. Hats off to Paul Angelis, who also voiced the opening narration, Ringo, and about half of George's dialogue after the original voice actor was arrested for deserting the British Army in West Germany. I feel so enriched by every frame of this film. Even the static images of the opening credits have so much going on that I can't look away from them. So much credit goes to the art director, Czech-German illustrator Heinz Eidelmann. Without his unique visual style, this film wouldn't be nearly as mystifying and iconic as it is. It's such a shame that his work on this film was often incorrectly attributed to a more famous artist. Hats off to director George Dunning too. He was only given a year to make this film, a quarter of the time Disney movies took, and a budget of only $1 million. He was the one who envisioned the beautiful Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds sequence too. The character animation is in a limited style that was more common for television productions, in which fewer frames are used per second, and characters are often static for a few frames. But with visuals like this, who can complain? If I talked about every wonderful sequence or style in this film, I'd be here all day. As for the music, it's a combination of songs from Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, alongside 4 original songs. All of them are absolutely marvellous. The originals aren't their best work, but they are still the Beatles, so they're still bloody brilliant. I love George Martin's soundtrack too, including how the title song is worked in. This film is the rock equivalent of Fantasia. I don't just mean because it uses animation to illustrate the music, but in that it showed the cultural elites of the time what animation could do. And, of course, the fact that it wasn't from Disney makes it all the more amazing. Not because it wasn't constrained to the formulaic trappings of Disney and its branding, but because it was practically the first non-Disney animated feature film that didn't tank the studio that made it. It's a near total rejection of logic that is both aesthetically very much of its time, yet timeless in its innovation and simplicity. I honestly can't believe this film exists. I can't believe I'm lucky enough to live in a universe in which it does. It's a must for any fan of the Beatles, the 60s, animation and just cinema. It's been over 50 years and we still haven't seen anything like it. If you want to watch me discuss 2 Beatles jukebox musicals that got it very wrong and very right, you can watch my video essay on the Sgt. Pepper movie and Across the Universe here. See you soon!